Miss Harper was once the shining star of Lakewood Elementary, the teacher every parent wanted for their child until an 11-year-old boy's sudden change in behavior exposed a dark secret that would shatter the town's trust forever. In the quiet town of Lakewood, everyone knew Miss Harper. She was the kind of teacher people hoped their children would have, someone who made learning feel exciting rather than like a chore. Parents often praised her at parent-teacher conferences, speaking proudly of how their children had suddenly started reading more or becoming interested in subjects they had never cared about before. Her classroom was decorated with bright colors, posters filled with encouragement, and little touches that made it feel like a second home to her students. She stayed after school to help children who were struggling and volunteered at nearly every school event. If there was a bake sale, she was there with trays of cookies. If there was a field trip, she was the one making sure no child was left behind. She seemed tireless, a figure who embodied everything good about education. To her colleagues, she was a breath of fresh air. While many teachers stuck to their routines, Ms. Harper always looked for new ways to make lessons more interactive. She wasn't afraid to try unusual methods to keep students engaged, and for a small-town school that rarely saw innovation, this was a big deal. Some older staff found her energy overwhelming, but most admired how naturally she connected with children. They said she had a gift, the kind of personality that made even the most restless students sit up and listen. That reputation spread quickly, making her a favorite among students, parents, and administrators alike. In the community, Ms. Harper's reputation grew beyond the walls of the school. She was often seen at the local library with stacks of children's books, leading summer reading groups, or helping organize charity events. Families trusted her with their children outside of school hours without hesitation. She was invited to birthday parties, community cookouts, and holiday celebrations. To many, she was more than just a teacher. She was a symbol of the town's values, caring, responsible, and deeply committed to shaping the next generation. Yet beneath the admiration, there were small signs that no one paid much attention to at the time. She spent long hours at the school, far more than her colleagues. Some said she was just dedicated, but others wondered if she didn't have much of a life outside of work. She was rarely seen with friends her own age, and when asked about her personal life, she gave vague answers, brushing off questions with a laugh. People assumed she was simply private or too focused on her career to think about much else. In truth, few were interested in digging deeper. After all, when someone appears to be doing so much good, it feels easier to accept the surface image than to ask uncomfortable questions. Looking back, some townspeople would admit there had always been something about her that didn't fully add up. But in that moment, Ms. Harper was seen as nothing short of a local treasure. No one could imagine she would ever be capable of anything harmful. In fact, many parents encouraged their children to confide in her, believing she was safe and trustworthy. They never realized that this trust, the very thing that elevated her to such a high place in their community, was also what made the betrayal that was about to unfold so devastating. It was the kind of blind faith that would later haunt everyone who thought they truly knew her. It began as little more than background noise in the crowded hallways of Lakewood Elementary. Children whispered in the corners of classrooms and at recess, saying things they didn't fully understand but repeated because it sounded strange, maybe even exciting. They said Miss Harper spent too much time with one boy, a quiet 11-year-old who had never really stood out before. His classmates noticed how she often called him up to her desk, lingering longer than she did with anyone else. Some said she gave him special privileges, allowing him to stay behind when everyone else left. Others swore they had seen her sit to close, speaking in tones that didn't feel like the way a teacher usually talked to a student. At first, these whispers seemed harmless, the kind of silly chatter that tends to fade as quickly as it appears. But something about it didn't fade. Instead, it grew louder. The boy's behavior shifted in ways too obvious for people not to notice. Once lively with his small group of friends, he started pulling away. He no longer laughed at their jokes during lunch or joined them on the playground. His grades, once steady, began to slide, and his teachers noticed his attention wandering during lessons. He often seemed distracted, staring off at nothing, as if his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He grew quieter at home, too, retreating into his room, refusing to share details of his day with his family. Parents often recognize when something is wrong, even if their children won't say it out loud, and his mother began to worry. Meanwhile, other students couldn't ignore what they were seeing. They joked about it at first, the way children sometimes do when they sense something unusual. But underneath the teasing, there was unease. They wondered why Ms. Harper treated him differently. They noticed she would ask him to help her carry things, walk with her to the teacher's lounge, or spend time in her classroom long after school had ended. The kind of attention she gave him was unlike anything they had seen before, and it didn't feel right. Though they lacked the words to explain why, the feeling was strong enough to keep fueling the whispers. One afternoon, as the chatter spilled out into the open, a parent overheard something unsettling. The children spoke about how Miss Harper had been too close with the boy, using language that sounded far more serious than simple favoritism. The parent froze, listening carefully as the details unfolded. It wasn't the playful gossip of children inventing stories. It sounded like something deeper, something that hinted at a line being crossed. Disturbed, the parent debated whether to step in, but the thought of ignoring such a claim was impossible to shake. That single moment changed everything. The rumor, once confined to small groups of children, quickly became a concern for adults. The school administration was contacted, and the uneasiness that had been quietly bubbling beneath the surface of the community was finally dragged into the open. For the first time, questions were asked directly about Miss Harper's behavior. What had once been whispers in the hallway now took on the weight of something serious, and the foundation of trust that had shielded her for so long began to crack. When the complaint reached the school office, administrators moved cautiously. Lakewood had never dealt with something of this nature before, and no one wanted to believe that their celebrated teacher could be at the center of such disturbing talk. Still, protocol demanded action. They quietly contacted local authorities, who arrived with the intention of handling the matter delicately but thoroughly. What began as a simple inquiry quickly grew into a full-scale investigation that revealed far more than anyone expected. Detectives started by speaking with the boy, whose nervous answers hinted at secrets he didn't know how to share. He hesitated, often staring at the floor, fumbling with his hands as though the weight of what he carried was too much for him. With time and patience, details emerged, small, fragmented pieces of a story that painted a troubling picture. The more he revealed, the clearer it became that Ms. Harper's attention had not been the innocent kind her colleagues and the community had assumed. Investigators didn't stop with his testimony. They searched for digital traces, combing through emails, text messages, and social media accounts. What they found was undeniable. Hidden beneath the surface of cheerful classroom photos and school-related updates were private conversations that no teacher should ever have with a student. The language, while carefully chosen at times, crossed professional boundaries again and again. It was calculated, secretive, and deeply unsettling. Screenshots were captured, messages preserved, and slowly the story pieced itself together. The discovery shocked those involved in the case. Ms. Harper had gone to great lengths to conceal her behavior, creating a double life that fooled everyone around her. On the outside, she was the model educator, beloved and trusted by nearly all. Behind closed doors, however, she nurtured an inappropriate relationship that exploited the very trust people placed in her. The contrast between her public image and her private actions made the betrayal feel even heavier. As investigators widened their search, they interviewed other students and staff. While no one else reported the same type of contact, several children admitted noticing how often Ms. Harper singled the boy out. They described long moments where he lingered at her desk, times he stayed after class when no one else did, and occasions when he walked with her in the hallways while others went home. Each account, though seemingly small on its own, built a pattern that matched what detectives were already uncovering in the digital evidence. The school community found itself in a state of disbelief. Parents who once praised Ms. Harper now struggled to accept what was being revealed. Some clung to denial, insisting there had to be a mistake, while others felt anger and betrayal that burned hotter with every new revelation. The administration cooperated fully, handing over records, schedules, and surveillance footage, anything that might help the case. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself, and the picture it formed left little room for doubt. By the time the investigation concluded, the evidence was overwhelming. There was no longer space for rumor or speculation. What had started as hushed whispers in school hallways had transformed into a solid case that pointed directly to Ms. Harper. For the detectives, the truth was clear, but for the town of Lakewood, the reality was only beginning to sink in. The trial drew more attention than anything Lakewood had seen in years. Courtrooms are usually quiet places, but when the case against Ms. Harper began, the seats filled quickly with townspeople, reporters, and families desperate to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Parents who had once trusted her with their children now sat in tense silence, watching the woman they once admired being led into the room in a prison uniform. The air was heavy, thick with disbelief and anger. For many, it was the first time they had seen her without the confident smile that had made her so popular. Instead, her face was pale, her shoulders slumped, and her eyes red from sleepless nights. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically, piece by piece. They showed digital messages that left no room for doubt, highlighting the inappropriate language and patterns that proved Ms. Harper had crossed the line. They presented accounts from the boy, delivered in careful, measured tones and supported by professional testimony from child psychologists. Each detail added weight to the case, making the betrayal sharper for the families in the room. The jury listened closely, some visibly disturbed as the evidence unfolded. It was impossible to ignore how a trusted figure had used her position to take advantage of the very people she was meant to protect. The defense tried to push back, suggesting that the situation had been exaggerated, that the messages were misinterpreted, that the boy had misunderstood the intentions behind her actions. They painted Ms. Harper as someone overwhelmed by personal struggles, arguing she had blurred boundaries without realizing the seriousness of her behavior. Yet, no matter how carefully they argued, the evidence spoke louder. The collected data, the corroborating stories, and the undeniable shift in the boy's behavior created a picture that was too clear to dismiss. Every attempt to weaken the prosecution's case seemed to fall flat. As the trial days stretched on, the emotional toll became obvious. Families cried quietly in the gallery, shaking their heads in disbelief. Teachers who had once stood beside Ms. Harper at staff meetings looked away, ashamed of ever having admired her. Reporters captured every moment, their headlines spreading the story far beyond Lakewood, turning the small-town scandal into a national headline. The once beloved teacher had become a cautionary figure, her name now synonymous with betrayal and disgrace. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, the courtroom went silent. The judge's words cut through the stillness, guilty. Ms. Harper's composure shattered in an instant. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the edge of the table, her sobs echoing in the courtroom. The image of the woman who had once seemed untouchable was replaced by a broken figure, her life forever altered by the choices she had made. As officers placed handcuffs around her wrists and led her out, many in the room felt no sympathy, only a deep sense of closure that justice had been served. The teacher who had once been celebrated was now locked away, her downfall complete. Lakewood was left to pick up the pieces after the verdict. The town that once took pride in its close-knit sense of trust now felt fractured, each person questioning how they could have missed the warning signs. Parents who had once praised Ms. Harper at every school meeting felt betrayed, replaying past moments in their minds and wondering if there had been clues they ignored. Some blamed themselves for not asking harder questions, while others turned their frustration toward the school district for not noticing what had been happening right under their noses. The sense of safety that had always defined the town seemed to vanish overnight. The boy at the center of the case faced the hardest road of all. With the trial behind him, the process of healing was only beginning. Counselors worked with him daily, helping him find ways to rebuild his confidence and sense of self. His family surrounded him with support, determined to shield him from the public attention that had swirled around their lives. Although many in the community wanted to help, his parents kept their distance, preferring privacy over sympathy. They knew that moving forward meant focusing on his future rather than the painful past that had been exposed for the world to see. The school itself underwent sweeping changes in the aftermath. New policies were implemented, creating stricter boundaries between teachers and students. Rules about one-on-one interactions were tightened, communication outside of school hours was heavily monitored, and training programs were introduced to ensure that staff recognized the warning signs of misconduct. Administrators spoke openly about the importance of rebuilding trust, acknowledging that it would take years before parents felt truly comfortable again. The scandal forced them to confront uncomfortable truths, and the lessons learned became the foundation for a safer environment. For the townspeople, the memory of Ms. Harper lingered like a shadow. Her name, once spoken with pride, became something most avoided mentioning. Some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminder of what had happened. Others stayed but carried a lingering caution into every interaction with authority figures. Where there had once been blind faith, now there was hesitation, a need to question, to look closer, to never assume appearances told the whole story. The innocence of the community had been shattered, replaced by vigilance. Inside prison walls, Ms. Harper's life was a stark contrast to the one she once knew. The teacher, who had once been admired by a whole town, now existed in isolation, stripped of the trust and respect that had defined her identity. Her downfall served as a grim reminder that choices have consequences, and betrayal of trust leaves scars that never truly fade. For her, tears and regret came too late, and the reality of her confinement was a punishment she would carry for years. Lakewood slowly moved forward, but the case became part of its history, told and retold as a warning. It was not just the story of a teacher-esque crime, but also of a town learning how fragile trust can be. The lessons left behind shaped how the community raised its children, how it watched over them, and how it reminded itself that evil can hide in the most unexpected places.